It's so great to be with you guys this morning. I love getting to know your pastor Luke and some familiar faces in the room here, and just the story of what God's doing here at Kish. And I'm excited to just be able to tell our story a little bit about what God's been doing at the PA Orphan Care Alliance, and use one of my favorite scriptures this morning. But I think we have a picture of my family on the screen here, so I want to introduce them. My wife and I have been married for almost 28 years. We have 6 children, ages 26 down to 8 years old. We graduated college and started kindergarten in the same year. And we just don't get to sit on the couch much, it seems. But their names are Kara, Katie, Carly, Kaylin, Callie, and Caden. And we never get their names right, but it was a great privilege this week when, CYS called and said, hey, we have a 3-year-old that we need a place for a little while. And we, with our biological children, we would always sit down and say, hey, we got this call. What do you guys think? Are we on board? And now we're able to do that with our 3 adopted children, and their answer this last week was an immediate yes, and they had to think about how we're going to rearrange the room so we could fit another one in for a season in our home. But that's just a little bit of who we are. And this morning I want to dive into just a great story in God's Word. But before I do that, I want to ask, as soon as children are old enough to speak, one of the first questions that parents ask them is, how big are you? And how do they respond, or how do we respond with them? Right? So big. And I see a bunch of you doing it. You're throwing your arms up. Like we want our kids to see themselves as growing, becoming something strong, not weak and easily intimidated. We want them to see who God is creating them to be. But today I want to ask kind of a much bigger question. How big is your God? How big is Christ in your life? And we're going to take a little while to look at that. And then I'm just going to do some storytelling and inviting you to take some next steps. I strongly believe that the way we live is a consequence of the size of our God. And the problem that many of us have is that our God is too small. When we wake up in the morning with a small view of God, then we're going to just live in this constant state of fear and anxiety because we think everything depends on us. And when human beings begin to shrink God, we start to offer prayer without faith, work without passion, service without joy, suffering without hope, and it just results in fear and anxiety and retreat and a lack of vision, and we just don't persevere when things get tough. And I, for one, think it's just a great time to create some God stories that are worth writing home about. God has put a purpose on each one of our lives. And it's important that we steward that and we discovered it and we walk into whatever that purpose is. And I just want to challenge you this morning to do something on God's behalf in the way of serving vulnerable children and families in our community. But what I'm going to do is take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 4, starting with verse 1. It tells us that one day Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost." But Jonathan did not tell his father what he was doing. Meanwhile, Saul and his 600 men were camped on the outskirts of Gibeah around the pomegranate tree at Migron. No one realized that Jonathan had left the Israelite camp. And to reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to go down between 2 rocky cliffs that were called Bozez and Seneh. The cliff on the north was in front of Michmash, and the one on the south was in front of Geba. "Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans," Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "and perhaps the Lord will help us. For nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few." "Do what you think is best," his armor bearer said. "I am with you completely, whatever you decide." "All right then," Jonathan told him, "we're going to cross over and we're going to let them see us. If they say to us, 'Stay where you are or we'll kill you,' then we're going to stop and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come on up and fight,' then we're going to go up. That's going to be the Lord's sign that he's going to help us defeat them." When the Philistines saw them coming, they shouted, "Look, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes." Then the men from the outpost shouted to Jonathan, "Come on up here and we're going to teach you a lesson." "Come on, climb right behind me," Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "for the Lord will help us defeat them." So they climbed up using both hands and feet, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer, killed those who came behind them. They killed some 20 men in all, and their bodies were scattered over about half an acre. Great bedtime story for your kids. Suddenly, panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including even the outpost and the raiding parties. And just then, an earthquake struck, and everyone was terrified. Then Saul and his men rushed out to the battle and found the Philistines killing each other. There was terrible confusion everywhere, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle continued to rage even beyond Beth-aven. I love this story on so many levels, but one of the things I want to make sure that's clear for all of us this morning is that bad things happen to good people who keep it in neutral. I was, as Ben said, I'm actually a cowboy. I have a degree in animal science from Penn State, and out of college I was working a pretty large farm in York, Pennsylvania, and one day my boss and I were moving about 60 cows with our pickup trucks, and as we were moving them, one of them got on the other side of his truck, and so he decided that he would jump out of the truck and go get that cow back with the rest of the herd. And as he did, he thought he was in good shape. He left the pickup parked on the top of a hill, and he left it in neutral. And as he's beginning to move the cow, you know where I'm going with this. I'm about 100 yards away, and I see his truck running down the hill, and he's starting to chase after it as if he's going to do something with it. But bad things happen to good people. So I told that story a couple of weeks ago at a church in Erie, and a guy sent me this picture after the service. He said, "This was my friend just the day before. He left it in neutral as he was getting his boat out of Lake Erie." The point is, bad things happen to good people that leave it in neutral, okay? And we've got Saul, this guy who is, okay, first of all, the Bible's full of mentors. There's about 400 of them. There's like good and bad mentors in the Bible, and we can learn from all of them. And Saul is one of these guys that's just a bad mentor for us. He's parked underneath a pomegranate tree in neutral, doing nothing. He is a do-nothing kind of guy. And Jonathan realizes that he can't tell his dad what he's going to do, because if he does, his dad's going to try to talk him out of it. It was Henry David Thoreau who said, "Most men live lives of quiet desperation, and they go to the grave with the song still in them." See, Saul focused way too much on not doing anything wrong. He was playing it safe and way too little time on doing something right. He tried to preserve his kingdom rather than making God's great. And I'm not convinced that the greatest tragedy is the things that we do wrong. It was Albert Schweitzer who said, "The tragedy of life is what dies inside a man when he lives." And I think too many of us are playing not to lose instead of playing to win. Again, we see in this story, Israel's held at bay by battalions of Philistines that control this pass at Michmash. And their leader is sitting under a pomegranate tree doing nothing. He's kicking back with a cluster of grapes because he was afraid. He didn't have his eyes on the mountain maker. He had his eyes on the mountains. So he wasn't playing to win. He was just playing not to lose. And instead of fighting on the front lines, he's sitting on the sidelines. And this wasn't an isolated incident for Saul. A few chapters later, we see that the Israelites are on one bank and the Philistines are on another, and there's a valley between them. And this guy Goliath's coming out for 40 days and saying, "Who's going to come down and fight me?" And it took a little shepherd boy named David who kind of comes out to check on his brothers, and he says, "Hey, I'll go fight this giant. Nobody can deal with my God." And the Bible tells us that Saul was head and shoulders taller than any other Israelite. So the only Israelite that had the size to be able to go and fight Goliath is a cowardly kind of guy sitting on the sidelines. And he sends in a little shepherd boy to do his fighting for him after he tried to talk him out of it. We see in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, that faith is being sure of what we hope for. Is being sure of what we do not see. See, faith starts when sight runs out. And when our eyes are fixed on Jesus, we see the mountain mover, we don't see the mountains. It was in Hebrews 11:6 where it says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Those who come to God must believe that he exists, and they must believe that he rewards those who earnestly seek him, who look to him. God will reward those who believe in him and earnestly seek him, and that's what Jonathan is doing here. Jonathan understands this. He's seeking God. He believed that he exists, and he puts his faith into action. And when we do the same, it pleases God. Saul's sitting on the sidelines. Again, it says no one was aware that Jonathan had left. But Jonathan's tired of sitting and waiting, so he is looking for some action. He says, let's go across to the outpost of those pagans. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, perhaps the Lord will help us. For nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. There is faith written all over this statement of Jonathan's. But I think I like the armor bearer's response almost more than I like Jonathan's. The armor bearer says, I'm with you whatever you decide. That guy is a gem. I think we underestimate the power of armor bearers way too much. Not all of us can be a Jonathan, but everyone can be an armor bearer. We need people in our lives that are going to be willing to fight with us no matter how bad the plan is. They're going to pray with us. They're going to encourage us. They're going to fight with us for the kingdom, even when we make a decision that's questionable. They're just willing to give it a shot with us anyway. Again, not all of us can be Jonathans, but all of us can get in on the action by finding a Jonathan and say, I'm with you, whatever you decide. And it pleases God when we do that. Matthew 25, verse 24 says, then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came and he said, Master, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and I went out and I hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. See, this guy's living in neutral. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I haven't sown, and you gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Neutral living, defined by Jesus here, is wicked. There's just a strong reaction from the master. Proactive waiting is something that puts it in gear. It's a decision that we make as Jesus followers to say, you know what, I'm going to get out and do something. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for something to happen. They just wait for something amazing to come along. And sometimes what we call waiting on God is really just a lack of faith. It's sitting under a pomegranate tree while we should be out stirring up some battles. It's burying our talents when we should be out taking some risks and investing them. It's holding on to our time and our talent and our treasure and our touch when we should be out sowing it generously. As I've taught over the years, as a pastor, I've heard stories over the years so many times of people who said to me, like, I felt like God told me that I was supposed to go on a mission trip. Or I felt like I was supposed to sponsor a child, or I was supposed to foster or adopt, or I was supposed to give a generous gift. And I'll talk to them a year and a half later, and they'll say, hey, I'm still praying about it. I think so many times what we call praying is really just a lack of faith and disobedience. If we've heard from God, it's already clear what we need to do. We need to step into that thing. We have been a steward. God has made us stewards of that idea or that whisper that he's put on our hearts. So if the Holy Spirit whispered something into your life to be generous, to give up, to sign up to serve, or to go on a missions trip, or sponsor a child, or forgive an enemy, or to pray actively, or to invite a neighbor to church, or to share your faith, or write a big check, if God whispered that on your heart, then do it. You were invited maybe by a Jonathan, maybe that's your pastor preaching or a Sunday school teacher, and they just said, I was an invitation on a perhaps God would show up. But maybe you respectfully declined and you joined Saul, and sometimes you've just couched that in the very spiritual terms where you said, I need to pray about it. Again, if that is you this morning, I may be here just to kick you in the pants and say, stop it. Stop praying. Go do what God's already told you to do and watch what happens. In James chapter 2, it says, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds, show me your faith without deeds, and I'm going to show you my faith by my deeds. God-given opportunities often come disguised as dead ends, and how we react when we come to the end is going to determine our destiny. We can cower in fear and we can run away from our greatest challenges, or we can chase our God-ordained destiny by seizing the God-ordained opportunities. So again, today, if there's a whisper from God on your life, that idea, that invitation is your opportunity. And I'm going to go so far as to say it's your stewardship responsibility. Sure, it may be a crazy idea, but that seems to be where God specializes. Proactive waiting is starting towards the Philistine army and waiting for God's response. Maybe you've heard Jim Elliott's quote where he says it's hard to steer a parked car. Get moving. God will move you along the way, but sitting under a pomegranate tree doesn't give God the opportunity to steer the car. See, I love this plan of Jonathan's, and the reason I love it is because it's a terrible plan. You see this? He's like, hey, let's go march across this open field and let the enemies see us. And if they say come up to us, we're going to go up and fight them. I'm thinking if I'm making a plan, let's wait until dark and we'll climb up and hopefully they'll be sleeping in their tents and we'll try to stir some action up that way. But I think there's some things we can learn from Jonathan's plans here. Again, he had faith in a great big God, and Jonathan's saying, you know what? Perhaps God will show up on our behalf. So Jonathan and his armor bearer are seen by the Philistines, and they say, hey, come on up. So they climb up the cliff, and the Bible says they use both hands and feet. Now, I've been in a sword fight with my 8-year-old son with a little Nerf thing. I haven't been in any major sword fights, but I'm going to guess that climbing a cliff with hands and feet right before you have a sword fight probably isn't the best way to prepare. Again, I just look at Jonathan's plan. There's so many bad things about his plan, but he had faith in a big God. They climb the cliff. They defeat an entire Philistine battalion. Triggers panic among the Philistines, so they start fleeing in every direction. And verse 23 says, the Lord saved Israel that day. Please don't miss this. The course of Israel's history was changed by one man with the right mindset. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. What if Jonathan had sat on the sidelines like the rest of the Israelites? If Jonathan hadn't done anything, nothing would have happened. Some of you came here today to hear this. You might have been hoping for something deeper, but simply, sometimes it's as simple as get off the sidelines. Do something. Because if you don't do anything, then nothing will happen. And God wants you to do something, and by so doing, you could very well save a family, a child, a community, a church, a nation. And God sends an earthquake at just the right time. And on behalf of Jonathan and his armor bearer, he saves the Israelite army. I haven't experienced a lot of earthquakes in my life, but I love watching God show up whenever I take it out of neutral and I start to drive. As I said, I have a degree in animal science from Penn State. I never intended to go into ministry, but God had other plans for me. My wife and I I was working this farm in York, Pennsylvania, God started to stir some stuff inside of us that we felt like we needed to do something to serve kids from hard places. I had some really good ideas of how I was going to make a lot of money and start this company and be able to buy a children's ranch and put cows and kids together. And my wife just looked at me and said, "That's a terrible idea, Vince. You have no clue what you're doing." So we agreed that we were going to pray together about it for like 30 days. So we prayed until April 1st of 1997, where we said we're going to make a decision on that day about what we think God's asking us to do next. So when we woke up that morning on April 1st, 1997, my wife looked at me and she said, Vince, why don't you think about going into youth ministry? I'm like, no way. Like, that's not interesting to me at all. Later that day, my mom calls me, and my wife and my mom had not talked, and my mom says to me, Vince, why don't you think about going into youth ministry? I'm like, no, Mom, bad idea. 2 hours later, a friend from high school I hadn't talked to for a very long time needed to chat, and he calls me, and he's living in Iowa, and he says, Vince, after he learned what we were kind of going through, he said, Vince, the youth pastor at our church just resigned, and they want to hire somebody that doesn't have a Bible college degree. Now, I'm pretty slow, but on April 1st, 1997, I knew where God was leading us. But it started with us committing to 30 days of prayer and knowing that we were going to take a step in whatever direction God was leading us. So we ended up in Iowa a few months later. Long story short, I ended up back in State College a few years later as a youth pastor at the church where I had attended while I was a student here at Penn State. Within a couple of years, I ended up becoming the lead pastor at State College Christian Church. And at the time, the church was about 100 people. It was about 50 years old. And there had been no adult that had ever gone on a mission trip in that church's 50-year history. They all agreed that it was a good idea. They had been given some money, and they said, hey, Vince, yeah, we love that, but I couldn't convince anybody to take the lead on that. So as I was beginning to be convicted that God was saying, hey, Vince, if it's going to happen, you're going to have to do it, I started to pray. And within a week of that prayer, I got an invitation to go to Zambia to help start a piggery. So now God's inviting me to go to Africa to use my animal science degree to start a piggery. And while my wife and I were in Zambia in 2006, we met a whole bunch of orphans for the very first time. At the time, 10% of the population was orphaned because of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And God started to do some things in our heart. And as the pastor of this small church, I was able to come back and I was able to start telling the story of what was happening in Zambia. So through a day camp that summer, we had 40 children that attended a day camp, and we told the story of what was going on in Zambia, and they raised $800, which I sent over to a friend, a Zambian friend, who used it to sponsor 3 kids in an existing orphan school. But then he sent me pictures, profiles of 15 children that were not eating meals every day, who were not going to school, who didn't have medical care, and were sleeping in the dirt. And when I shared those profiles with my small congregation, almost immediately individuals started to sponsor them. Then he sent me another 15 profiles, and before we knew it, this small church in State College is sponsoring 46 children. And my friend sends me an email. He says, Vince, we're going to start a school for these kids, and we're going to call it State College Christian Church School for the Orphans. While we were flattered, we thought probably not a great name for a school in Zambia. So we asked him to rename it, and he and the kids did, and they called it Haven of Hope. And Haven of Hope ended up expanding over the next handful of years to being 2 schools in Zambia and a school in Uganda, with more than 350 children being sponsored by dozens of churches. And as I started to take some, in the next 3 years as a pastor there, 35% of the congregation went over to Zambia to meet their sponsored child. And one of the first people that I ever took over there was a nurse, and she met her sponsored child, and her sponsored child just graduated college a year and a half ago and is now a nurse in Zambia. One of the other guys I took on one of those first trips was a pastor, and when he met his sponsored child just graduated from college a year and a half ago and is now serving as a pastor in Zambia. And we just started to realize that there's so many things that God can do on a perhaps. So kind of backing up on that story a little bit, a year and a half after that first trip to Zambia, my friend from Zambia emails and said, Vince, would you come over and train some pastors for us in Zambia? And first of all, I'm like, hey, I'm an animal science guy. I don't have a Bible college degree, so I'm probably the wrong guy to train pastors. But it was one of those deals where I said, perhaps we can go teach a few leadership principles. Well, I emailed him and said, so tell me, how many pastors are you thinking about, and what do you want the theme to be for this training? And he emails me back and he says, Vince, there's going to be 500 pastors. I'm like, wrong guy. And we want the theme verse to be Nehemiah 2:17. And Nehemiah 2:17 it says it's a time to rebuild. And they were just needing to rebuild with all the HIV/AIDS issues that were going on. And so we said perhaps, and I had just finished reading a book called Visioneering, written by Andy Stanley. And if you're familiar with the book was based entirely on the book of Nehemiah. So I just finished reading it, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to email Andy Stanley's ministry and just see if they'd be willing to give us 500 books for a really good price that we could take over and share with pastors. His ministry emails back and says, we don't normally do this, but we're going to drop ship you 500 books for free so you can take those over. A friend who is also an author and a speaker ended up learning of this trip, and she says, Vince, I'm going to give you 100 of my books, the Burning Heart contract, to be able to take over with you as well. And so now we have 600 books that we're taking over, and it turns out the 600 pastors showed up at the 2 different trainings in 2 different cities. And God just did some stuff as our team went over and just spoke into the lives of pastors. And one of the trainings was about 10 hours away from where our school is at. And it was in a very remote kind of village where 300 pastors had come together, and some of these pastors were hiking 3 days to be able to get to the training. I'm like, didn't you guys tell them, like, there's a cowboy, not a pastor coming to do this training? But 3 years later, my wife and I were on the streets of Andola, about 8 hours away from that town, and some guy comes running across the street, and he says, Vince, Pastor Vince. He says, you won't remember me, but I was at this training in Ampika a couple of years ago, and I just want you to know that God has rewritten the story in our village. The pastors before that training were not working together, but now we're working together rather than seeing each other as competition, and God has rewritten the story in our community. And we're still using those books to help guide our leadership. I just thought, only God. So as a pastor, I'm meeting with 13 other pastors in State College on a weekly basis, and those pastors are all praying together, and they're saying, at one point said, hey, we should probably start doing something together to serve our community beyond just praying. And again, as a untrained, unschooled pastor sitting in a room with some really good, smart guys, that was like my least favorite meeting of the week. Because these guys, I just felt very intimidated with them. But again, it was one of those moments where I was in a room where it became fertile soil to say to those pastors, what if we started an orphan care ministry together? And those other 12 pastors said, absolutely, let's do that. So I asked them if they'd be willing to find a representative from their church that was willing to meet with representatives from the other churches in Center County. And they said, yes, we'll find that. So within a few months after we started meeting together, we officially became what was the Center County Orphan Care Alliance. Shortly after that, I was on an elevator ride with one of the directors of Children and Youth Services in Center County, and I said to her, as a church in our region, how can we serve your agency? And she looked at me and she said, you guys are the church, you'll do one event and we will not hear from you again. I thought, ouch, we need to rewrite that story. Thankfully, within a year and a half, the church in Center County had become the #1 recruiter of foster and adoptive homes, and the agencies realized we weren't going away. And they said, hey, can we start coming to your meetings? And we're so thankful that 14 years into it, they're still sitting at the table, and we've got a great relationship, and we've been able to be the #1 recruiter of foster and adoptive homes, and God's just been doing some really, really cool stuff over the years. But here's one of the things that we started to realize as we got into foster care and adoption is that 4 years into it, we were starting to see foster families drop out about as fast as we were recruiting them. Because if you've ever been up close to a foster or adoptive family, you know it's hard work. When you invite kids from hard places into your home, it kind of wrecks the structure of things and the way they go, and it is just hard work. So we realized we needed to do a better job of supporting those that we were recruiting. So one of the first things that we did is we said, we're going to start an email list. We called it our James 127 email list. And that first year, 30 people through an event we did signed up to receive an email anytime one of our local agencies had a need. They would reach out to us and we would send it out, and maybe they would need a stroller for a family who just took in a child, or a crib. Or over the years, it's been things like a grandma who is fostering her grandchildren who needed a gas card so she could get to appointments. So over the years, that list grew from 30 to 550 people in Center County who were saying, yes, I'm willing to receive an email. And then the agencies would reach out and we'd send that email out. And we just saw God starting to meet need after need. One of my favorite uses of that list was a biological mom who was trying to get her child back. And the agency said, we need to find a new friend group for her. Can you find a church in her neighborhood that would be willing to help? We were able to connect that mom with a church, and she got her son back a handful of months later, and her son and her are still a part of that local church community. So a year ago, well, I'll get into that story in a minute. So as a pastor then, over the next handful of years, I just started to feel about a year and a half or two ago that God was saying, Vince, it's time to take what's happening in Center County to the other 66 counties in the state of Pennsylvania. For us, again, it was like we were very comfortable. I loved the church that I was pastoring. It would have been easy to just kind of stay in that mode and coast. But we knew that God was whispering, and I know that that was my God-given responsibility to steward that idea. So my wife and I said, let's do this. So a year and a half ago, we had no idea what that was going to mean, but as soon as we went public with it, it was fun to see what God started to do. It turns out there had been some people in counties around the state of Pennsylvania who God was already pushing on their hearts for well over a year, saying, hey, you need to do something more in the area of supporting and recruiting foster and adoptive homes. So fast forward, long story short, a year ago, October, we were still just in Center County, but now we're officially launched in 10 counties around the state, and each of those counties has a coordinator who's overseeing those local efforts, and we're able to meet together weekly via Zoom, and we're able to strategize together on how we can serve better in our local communities. In the state of Pennsylvania, there's 14,000 children in foster care. In the state of Pennsylvania, there's 14,000 churches. When the church does what the church is supposed to do, there's a non-issue. And as a pastor of a small church, I started to realize it wasn't that my church didn't care, they just didn't know what the needs were, and they didn't know how to take a next step. So it's our passion to go around the state and say, church, here's the need. Are you willing to take some steps into the lives of the least of these and be the hands and feet of Jesus? In the state of Pennsylvania, there's more than 2,000 children who are available for adoption today. Their parental rights have already been terminated. And most of those children are going to sit on a waiting list for 5 to 7 years before they find a forever family. 1,100 of them are going to age out of the system this year with no forever family. And when they do, 80% of those boys are going to be in jail within 2 years. 70% of their girls are going to be pregnant and single before they're age 21. But if we, the church, walk into their stories and say, you're mine, I'm not going to give up on you. I realize this is going to be maybe the hardest thing that I've ever done, but we can help rewrite that story for the state of Pennsylvania. And I love that churches like yours are already doing it. You're taking steps in that direction. So we had started, as we moved kind of going into the state of Pennsylvania a year or so ago, we hired a company to build out a program, an online platform that's called Gateway. Maybe you've heard of it before, and you'll see that there's a handout in your bulletin this morning if you got one of those. There's a QR code there that would take you to the website where you're able to register. It takes like 2 minutes to register. And if you register, you're simply saying, I'm willing to receive an email anytime one of your local social workers has a need. And I was just sitting in the office of children and youth here in Mifflin County on Friday with the CYS director. And she is extremely grateful for the way this is already beginning to bless your community. We make sure there's at least 50 volunteers registered before we turn it on. Fortunately, in Mifflin County, we've already hit that, and it is turned on, and your local agencies are already using it to meet needs, and it's been a huge blessing to them. So I want to encourage you to go to the website, take 2 minutes to register. All you're doing is saying, hey, I'm going to receive an email. And if you can't meet the need, you delete it. But maybe if you have a bed sitting in your house and they need a bed and you were going to take it to Goodwill anyway, you're connecting with the needs of your local social workers and they'll distribute it to where the need is. So the other thing that we started to realize is, again, we needed to do a better job of wrapping around those foster families that we're recruiting. So we learned of a ministry called Promise 686, and we're now an affiliate of Promise 686. Where we're building engineered care communities. And Ann and Janelle have already been through that, what is called advocate training here for your church, and what they have been equipped to be able to build these engineered care communities. And I'm going to get the date wrong. Ann, when is the training? Is it November 12th? November 12th. And is that information in a bulletin? I should have looked close. It will be. Okay. Yep. Awesome. So if you go to the website, follow the QR code, it's going to take you to a care community page, and there's a 2-minute video on there explains how these care communities work. But here's the deal. 90% of foster families drop out before 2 years. If they have a care community, 90% of them are still doing it beyond 2 years. Not everybody can foster or adopt, but everyone can do something. Those foster families need armor bearers to help them be able to stay in the game. And so we're saying, Fred, can you be on a care team? You volunteer to be on a care team, you're saying, I'm willing to take a meal 1 time per month to that foster family. When my wife and I had a sibling group of 4 dropped off at our house 3 years ago, it was absolute chaos. They had no boundaries. They never sat down together at a meal. And it was crazy. And so when somebody showed up at our house that night with a lasagna, my wife was like, praise Jesus. We can make it through the night. And the next morning, those kids, along with ours, had to go to 4 different schools. We needed help with transportation. And when somebody says, I'll help provide a ride, it made all the difference in the world. And if you're able to be on a team and help provide a meal or transportation or babysitting to help that foster family, you are rewriting the story of a kid's life. And when a foster family wins, everyone wins. We don't have foster families dropping out. We don't have kids bouncing to 6, 7, 8 different homes during their stay in foster care, and it rewrites the story. So I want to encourage you to go consider taking those next steps. Here in Mifflin County, your population as a county isn't huge, but you have a pretty good number of kids based on population. There's about an average of 50 kids in foster care at any given time. Just a week ago Friday, there was a sibling group of 5 that had to be placed in your county, and they didn't have homes for all of those kids, and they had to break up those 5 siblings. So first of all, we've got kids being removed from their home of origin. Now they have to be broke up and spread, and many of them not able to stay in the county because there's not enough foster homes. So they're shipped now out of county, out of school district, and everything in their life story changes. So at one of our missions at the Pennsylvania Orphan Care Alliance, well, I'm going to tell you what our 4-part vision is this. We just started to say, what if we could recruit at least 3 foster families in all 500 Pennsylvania school districts, willing to take sibling groups and children over the age of 8 years old. They are the unwanted kids who many will age out of the system. So we said there's enough churches to be able to do that. So what if we could recruit at least 3 foster families in every school district? And then as we recruit them, what if we can make sure they have a wraparound support team, a care community that will support them on that journey? And then we said, what if we could get at least 550 people in all 67 Pennsylvania counties registered to use Gateway so that we'd have more than 35,000 Jesus followers in the state of Pennsylvania ready to respond to the needs anytime a local social worker places one on that system. And then finally, we were saying, what if we could get at least 39 churches in all 67 counties to work together on this issue? And we picked 39 because in Center County, that's how many we were working with. We thought if the church can work together, and we can get the church together in the same room and work on this issue, we can rewrite the story for Pennsylvania's kids. And it's close to the heart of God. I know it's close to so many of your hearts, as I've already talked to so many of you from this congregation. So again, Ian and Janelle are working at making some things happen for your congregation. Your pastor has been so instrumental in helping to get the Mifflin County Orphan Care Alliance launched. And just a couple of weeks ago, Milt Harold, who is the pastor at Big Valley Alliance, your pastor and several others recommended him as the right guy to be the county coordinator for Mifflin County. So he's officially come on staff at the Alliance because of, if you were at the combined service last week, you guys gave more than $4,000, which allowed us to say, hey, we can bring him on staff. So he'll be coordinating efforts for Mifflin County. And so our ask is just like, hey, can you register for Gateway? Will you consider being on a care community? Will you consider being a foster or adoptive family? And if God whispers that even a little bit on your heart, I want to say take this step. Don't pray about it. He's already said that we're supposed to take care of orphans and widows, and we're supposed to love the least of these. So start moving and pray as you go. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you that you are such a great, big God. And when we have faith in you and we actually take steps of faith that show that we believe that you will show up, you do miracles on our behalf. And I just want to pray, God, that you will allow that to happen here in Mifflin County. My prayer is for anyone in this room this morning who has heard a whisper from you, whether it's in this area of caring for vulnerable children or if it's in some other area, God, that you will give them the courage this very day to stop praying about it and start making movement in the direction of obedience. So that, God, we have so many cool stories coming out of Kish Valley that all we can do is stand in awe of you. God, would you help us as Jesus followers to bring your kingdom from heaven to earth through obeying what you've already asked us to do. Thanks for being a faithful God who sees us and cares for us. In Jesus' name, amen.